Hello, and welcome to this Pharmaron podcast, part of our DMPK Insights podcast series. My name is Scott Summerfield, and I lead the Metabolism group in our UK-based integrated DMPK discovery and development platform. Well, today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Matt Segall to discuss the influence of QSAR and Phys-Chem descriptors on drug design, where we'll be covering a brief history, key steps to take us where we are today, and also some thoughts on the future. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Scott. It's great to speak to you today.
By way of introduction, Matt is CEO of Optibrium. He has a Master's of Science in Computation from the University of Oxford and a PhD in Theoretical Physics from the University of Cambridge. As Associate Director at Chemetro in the UK, Arcule, and in Informatica, he led a team developing predictive ADME models and state-of-the-art intuitive decision support and visualization tools for drug discovery. In 2006, Matt became responsible for the management of Informatica's ADME business, including experimental ADME services and the StarDrop software platform. Following the acquisition of Informatica, Matt became Senior Director responsible for Biofocus's DPI's ADMET division, and in 2009, led a management buyout of the StarDrop business and found Optibrium, which develops software and AI solutions for small molecules, design, optimization, and data analysis. Matt has over 30 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters based in the areas of computational chemistry, cheminformatics, and drug discovery. So Matt, firstly, so you have a background originating in computation and physics. And so I wondered how you were drawn to using those skills in DMPK.
Yes, Scott, it's certainly an unusual background to go into DMPK. I guess, as you said, I did an undergraduate degree in physics, a master's degree in computation, so I was interested in computational physics. But I've always been sort of fascinated by the boundaries between different scientific fields. I think it's often the most fruitful to take methods from one discipline and apply it in another. And I have a family background in the pharma industry. And so when I was interviewing for my PhD in computational physics with my then supervisor, Mike Payne, who was interested in sort of applying sort of quantum mechanical simulations at a sort of atomistic level, so atoms and electrons, I just happened to say, well, have you ever thought of applying this in biology? And his sort of eyes lit up and he was like, oh, I'd love to do that, but I don't know anyone who would be interested in taking that on. I said, yeah, sure. I'd love to give it a go. I have some contacts, through my family in the industry. We can, see what might be possible. And then when searching for appropriate applications, I mean, this is back in the 90s, so this was really hadn't been tried before. I was chatting with a professor in Sheffield, Professor Jeff Tucker, who many of your listeners may know, ultimately founded SimCip. He was and is an expert in DMPK, and particularly had an interest in cytochrome P450s. And chatting with him, realized it was almost the perfect application of these quantum mechanical methods, because we're trying to model a reaction. There's a very clear signal we can look for to see if the calculations are working. And so that's what I did my PhD on. Started doing a bit of a postdoc. That got the interest of what was then Glaxo Wellcome, again, dating myself. And they were really interested in seeing what would be possible in that space. And so, ultimately, got involved in DMPK, drug discovery, and that's led me to where I am today.
Well, thank you. I mean, you do highlight something I think that's really important, particularly in DMPK. Like, it's not you don't go to university to study drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics. It's kind of a family of really big things. Physiology, pharmacology, chemistry, physics, maths, and some of those latter ones in computing have come in later. And I guess that was, you graduated at a good time, I guess, when all of those were beginning to become important, as we're trying to get out of the era of not very strong delivery of new medicines. The pipeline was quite poor then, but I guess, computational chemistry has made a big part of improving that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a growing sort of area of application. I mean, all the way from the sort of the 1970s, 1980s onwards, but the really sort of hit its stride in the late 90s, 2000s, and so on. And I think continuing today, which I'm looking forward to discussing more.
Yeah. So, interesting. We live in a world where, the number of scientific papers and discoveries is it's orders of magnitude higher than, even a few decades ago. And one of these podcasts, one of the values of these podcasts really is to link key milestones on the past to the current state of the art, and then how these will lead to new possibilities in the future. So we'll start with the reflective piece, and kind of get your thoughts on the key driving forces that led to the early exploration of QSAR and Phys-Chem descriptors for kind of DMPK optimization specifically.
Yeah, I mean, again, this really goes back to the 1990s. I think that was sort of the start of the era of sort of really target focused drug discovery. And there was a lot of focus in sort of early drug discovery on, optimizing potency to a very, very high degree. And ADME and DMPK was sort of thought of as something downstream. We'll let other people worry about that once we get into preclinical development, and we can fix any issues in formulation later on. And what that ultimately led to was, a very large number of clinical failures due to DMPK issues. I think the key paper that everyone cites is the paper by Kennedy in 1997, where he was talking about sort of 40% of compounds failing in the clinic due to sort of DMPK issues. Now, we need to be a little bit careful about that, because if you read the paper carefully, he was very clear that that data set was somewhat biased towards anti-infectives, which had greater DMPK issues. But ultimately, the picture was correct. There wasn't enough attention being played to ADME and to DMPK early in the process. And a number of pharma companies noticed that. And that was really the advent of what was then called early ADME. So bringing ADME screens early in the drug discovery process and using those to sort of de-risk the compounds being progressed. I mean, several pharma companies took that initiative. The one I'm most familiar with, due to my relationship back then with GSK, was the Combinatorial Lead Optimization Project, or CLOP, which was run by one of my bosses, ultimately Mike Tarbit. So this was generating what we now think of very conventional things like permeability assays, microsomal stability earlier on. But the advent of these higher throughput screens and early drug discovery led to the availability of a lot more data. And so attention naturally turned to, well, given all this extra data, can we apply these QSAR methods that had historically been used for predicting compound potency and activity to predicting, ADME properties, DMPK, and so on. And so that's really was the genesis of the whole field of computational ADME and DMPK. The other outcome of this was sort of the recognition that some of these characteristics could be at least encoded or de-risked through considering simple Phys-Chem properties. And of course, the most famous example of that is Lipinski's rule of 5. So just looking at 4 simple properties, the log P, the molecular weight, the number of hydrogen bond owners and acceptors. This has been was a fantastic tool for raising awareness of the importance of getting into the right chemical space to achieve oral bioavailability or whatever route of administration you're looking for. Again, it's one of these things which you have to be careful not to overinterpret. Lipinski's rule of 5 are some nice guidelines, but they're far from hard and fast rules. I mean, we see now the advent of beyond rule of 5 compounds. And so, you don't want to. Some people have taken the approach of sort of using that to define drug-like, but that's probably taking it a bit far. Nonetheless, there have been sort of many similar guidelines that have come from this that at least have helped drug discovery projects to focus in areas of chemical space where they're much more likely to find compounds with good ADME and PK properties.
Thanks, Matt. I guess you mentioned the sort of advent of higher throughput kind of permeability screens and stuff like that. I mean, I was curious as you were talking about whether kind of the, let's say, data quality or the curation was how early was that recognized? Because obviously any model needs a good data set. So yeah, what was it like back then?
A little bit of a wild west, in fact, arguably it still is. I think you've touched on a really important point, which is quality, consistent data is key. So if you're in a large pharma company now, there are hundreds of thousands of data points and consistent assays in the same lab with the same protocol that are really high quality data sets to use to build these QSAR models. And this is now sort of run of the mill stuff in a large pharma company. But if you're trying to build your own data set, maybe in a smaller company, being in some public domain literature data and so on, you need to be very, very careful indeed to look at the assay protocols used to generate that data and make sure they are genuinely comparable. If you just collect, for example, if you collect every data point labeled HERG IC50 from the literature, throw it into a big pot and try to build a model, what you're going to be doing is modeling the difference between the different experimental protocols and essentially the noise in that data, and not really capturing that structure activity relationships that will enable you to make good predictions for new compounds.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I was wondering as well, as you were talking, because obviously, I mean, I don't know what computational science was like back then. Obviously, computing was let's say simpler. I can't think of the right word, but the sort of level of computation that you could do and on an average system was much less than today. So with that increasing computational power and also the knowledge that we've been able to build off the back of that computational power, what would you say today we can do well, and where do you think we might see the short-term improvements?
Another great point. I mean, if you go back to the 90s, the comparatively speaking, the computers were steam powered. I started my PhD on a Cray XMP. So anyone who's a computer geek out there will know it's one of these huge cabinet sized things with, cooling systems and all sorts of, it looked really cool. But frankly, it's about the same as an iPhone nowadays. In fact, it's probably even a bit slower than an iPhone would be. So yeah, there clearly have been huge advances in the intervening decades. So what do we do really well now? So machine learning models have come on leaps and bounds. The methods being developed in companies, like Google and so on, have really improved the sophistication with which we can model this data that we're trying to understand and to make predictions with. Now, one needs to be careful translating that into the space of drug discovery, because actually the data we deal with is different in a few ways. First of all, it's a lot smaller. We think we've got big data sets now, but actually on the scale of Google, they're tiny, and their data is noisy. So it's not very straightforward to just simply repurpose these methods. But where they've been carefully explored and carefully translated into this domain, they've had a really significant impact. And so for simple Phys, Chem, and ADME properties, these are now run-of-the-mill approaches being used routinely in every pharma and pretty much all biotech companies, and having a real impact. There was a great paper published by actually an industry consortium. The lead author was Lombardo. This is back in 2017, where they actually looked at the impact of predictive ADME models across their companies and see how they were influencing the compounds being synthesized and tested. And they saw a dramatic shift towards compounds being synthesized and tested with good ADME properties like solubility, metabolic stability, and so on. So they were being assessed in silico, and the best compounds were moving forward. And that was, just really improving the quality of the compounds being progressed in the drug discovery projects. But there's more sophisticated methods coming on stream now. So a big area with my background in physics is actually using quantum methods in a practical day-to-day way. So back when I was doing my PhD, it would take weeks to run a calculation. But now we can actually start to deploy these quantum mechanical methods where they add a lot of value. Particularly where there are reactions occurring. Again, background in drug metabolism, that's obviously a catalytic reaction at the active site. And so using these quantum mechanical methods to model those and simulate those reactions and really get very valuable inputs to these models, like activation energies and hence rates of different reactions and so on, can add enormously to the precision of the predictions we can make in areas like metabolism, pKa, and so on. So that has been and continues to be a big area of development. And then an area that I'm particularly excited about is in what's called data imputation. And what this enables us to do is use early stage ADME data, for example, permeability, metabolic stability, solubility, protein binding, and so on, actually as inputs to a machine learning model that will predict downstream much more complex endpoints like pharmacokinetics. And we published a paper with AstraZeneca demonstrating this approach. The challenge with these, in vivo properties, particularly drug disposition and PK, is that, of course, they're governed by multiple factors, and trying to dissect the influence of compound structure on all these different factors and combine that into a prediction of PK would require vast amounts of data. But of course, as we know, that's where we have the least data because they're extremely expensive, time-consuming experiments. We want to minimize our use of animals. So these new so-called imputation approaches for leveraging data where we have it to make more accurate predictions of those downstream, much more informative and clinically relevant outcomes is a really exciting new area.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the kind of Lipinski's rule of five. So you've got hydrogen bond donors and acceptors, log P, which obviously has an influence across various parts of the kind of life cycle of a drug, from site of administration to the site of ultimate action. And I was wondering, with that computation and maybe the time that we've had to think about phys-chem descriptors, have there any? Do you think there've been any kind of advances or additional descriptions of molecules? Maybe even simple kind of like descriptors, or maybe even more complex ones, I guess, that you might be able to pull out through quantum mechanical approaches. They might be a bit abstract to us, but I just wondered whether what you thought were key developments beyond sort of hydrogen bond donors and acceptors.
Yeah, I think that is a key area of development. Essentially, the way that most QSAR models work is by using very simple descriptors. So basically patterns of atoms that occur within those molecules. Each individual descriptor has very little information content about how that compound interacts with its surroundings, with proteins, with other molecules, and so on. And so what you end up with is actually a very complex model that tries to integrate lots and lots of inputs, each of which have very little information, into an overall prediction. And so I'm a strong believer that the closer we can get to describing those molecules based on the fundamental physics and chemistry of what's going on, the more information content those descriptors will have, and hence the simpler, more transferable, and more predictive those models will be. And so, yes, characterizing them in terms of the actual sort of three-dimensional structure of those compounds, the the charge distributions, the energetics of, for example, obviously pKa is about either removing or adding a proton. And if we can actually look at the energetics of that and use that as inputs to these machine learning models, we'll get much better models in the long term, and actually you be able to use smaller data sets of higher quality data with which to build those models.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a piece actually, because obviously, so it's unlikely to go back to the days of Klopp. And actually, I remember when I joined GSK at the time, that word was used quite a lot. That phrase. You mentioned energetics twice. One just a moment ago, and also activation kind of energies as well. So, and that brings in, kind of thermodynamics, and obviously that's really important for target binding, and any movement of drug across a membrane or any process requires some thermodynamic consideration. I guess you don't get that in like you say, in a simple descriptor, which from that sense is probably quite a flat parameter.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of quantum mechanical calculations and all the models that that can come forward that way, I guess the kind of assessment of free energies and etc. Is that an important part of the way that those models work? So it's my naivety. I'm just curious.
Yeah. The challenge that we have, of course, is that real life biological systems are dynamic systems. Things are moving, the molecules are changing conformation, they're interacting with each other in a dynamic sense. And the way we characterize our molecules typically is very static. We look at the structure of the molecule in the simplest case as a 2D structure, the graph structure of the compound. Never mind looking at it in 3D, never mind looking at how that 3D conformation changes. So there are levels of abstraction and approximation that we're always using. At a quantum mechanical level, even there, we're really looking at a snapshot of the molecule, sort of a static picture, if you like, of that molecule. In an ideal world, we would run dynamic simulations, and we could look at free energies exactly as you say. And for that, we'd be looking at sort of molecular dynamics. We're not there yet, even given today's computational power, to be able to do that on a routine basis. There are what are called empirical molecular dynamics, so using simple approximations to the forces between atoms, and they can run for time frames that are meaningful in a biological sense, but it's still a very expensive calculation to do. If we then try to go to quantum mechanics, which are orders of magnitude more computationally intensive, then we're not able to run molecular dynamics for long enough to really see, get a good picture of the free energy. Now, that also may be changing, thinking a little bit further into the future. A really exciting area that's being explored at the moment is actually a hybrid between quantum mechanics and machine learning. These are what are called machine learning potentials. So by taking large databases of very accurate quantum mechanical simulations, we can actually train these interatomic potentials to using machine learning to actually use those in these molecular dynamics simulations that are much more accurate than the very simple potentials we typically use nowadays. So essentially getting quantum mechanical level accuracy with the speed of an empirical simulation. So that's a direction that we're heading in, but we're not there yet.
And coming back to the point that you mentioned earlier, Matt, around all of 5 descriptors, hydrogen bond donors, acceptors, etc. And I think you also mentioned calculation of pKa's, which require some chemical sort of intuition, I guess, or knowledge. What would you say is driving kind of predictability, quality of those Phys-Chem measurements that are being done in silico?
Yeah, so I guess there are three factors that improve the quality of a model. One is data. So as the size and of high quality data sets are increasing, then that's obviously one factor that leads to the improvement in the quality of the model. The second is, as we discussed, is the way we characterize or describe those molecules as inputs. So, being able to more describe those molecules in a more sophisticated way than simple descriptors. So we mentioned quantum mechanics, for example, but other ways to represent those. And the third is the sophistication of the machine learning algorithms. As they get better and better at recognizing patterns, and the quality of the predictions increase over time. And certainly that's a trend that we've seen. But there's a sort of a tension between the quality of prediction, where we're looking at sort of within the chemical space that the model has been trained on, and transferability of that model as well. So, how well can that model extrapolate to new chemistries? And again, representing those molecules in ways that relate to the sort of the fundamentals of physics and chemistry gives us greater transferability. But we also have to ensure that the models recognize when they are extrapolating beyond what they can confidently predict. So a big area is making sure that each model prediction has an associated uncertainty, so that the model recognizes when it's gone beyond where it can make a confident prediction, and be really transparent about that to the ultimate user.
Okay, cool. You touched on a topic as well, which is generating a huge amount of interest, generally, like beyond rule of 5 molecules. There have always been molecules that were molecular weight 1,000, etc. That they've always been there, almost like flagpoles. By inference, they don't meet even Lipinski's rules. That's obviously, I'm not teaching you nothing you don't know, but and in some ways, particularly in DMPK, for example, we're kind of back to square one. A lot of the in vitro assays and those kind of measurements are really hard to do when you've got very lipophilic molecules. Sometimes it's almost impossible to measure the protein binding without adding something, and then, do you really have a true measure or not? I wondered about the kind of Phys-Chem space and QSAR, etc., and where that kind of is with those molecules. Is that a step back as well, or are there any things in that space that we can take forward from the descriptors, etc., that we have that are maybe applicable there?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge on the computational side as well. So we talked about dynamics, so this actually segues very nicely, which is that the challenge with these molecules is they're much larger and they're much more flexible. So they have a much higher degree of conformational freedom than a typical small molecule drug, which tends to be relatively rigid. And so, because that it's a relatively rigid structure, we can characterize it using these sort of molecular descriptors. But when you're talking about one of these large flexible molecules, it doesn't just sit in one conformation. It can change conformation depending on the environment it's in or what it's binding to and so on. And in fact, those conformations can be exquisitely sensitive to small changes in the structure. So simple sort of SAR almost breaks down because, you can lock in entirely new conformations from a single substitution. So this is a really big unmet challenge in the sort of the QSAR space, or even, more conventional 3D molecular modeling struggles with these beyond rule of 5 compounds. It's an area that actually I'm really interested in, and some of our team are working on, are really sophisticated approaches for the 3D modeling of these structures, and actually showing some remarkable results in collaboration with Merck and BMS and others, to use small amounts of biophysical data and much more sophisticated explorations of conformational spaces to be able to really model these in 3D for the first time. And you really do need to model them in 3D for the reasons we've just discussed. So it is a big area of challenge. The other way that we found to approach this is using the imputation approach I spoke about before, which is if you have even a small amount of experimental data on these compounds, you can leverage that to make much better predictions of properties that are just impossible to model in that chemical space with QSAR models. And we did a webinar with Merck just towards the end of last year, demonstrating the first application of these approaches in peptides and particularly macrocyclic compounds. And we're working on a paper, so watch this space.
Good plug. Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, maybe there's a rule of something out there. It won't be as simple as the rule of five, I'm sure, but it, obviously there's quite a strong reliance even now on in vivo work, which is in some ways, not what you want. You want in vitro assays first, but in some areas that's been a challenge for these beyond rule of five molecules. So be good to see what comes forward. So you mentioned one of the kind of thoughts on the future, which is the kind of combination of machine learning and quantum mechanics. Where do you feel there are, other significant advancements that might be on the horizon or will come? And I guess as well, do you think there are any things that the life sciences industry needs to do collectively, data curation, etc., and protocols? Something you mentioned earlier in the standardization, but kind of collaboration, data transparency, those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've covered some of the sort of longer term developments that I see as being really important already, but there, certainly more. And it's all about the data at the end of the day. Any model is only as good as the data on which you build it. And of course, the large global pharma companies have this sort of rich seam of historical, consistent, high quality data. I'd love to suggest a consortium for data sharing to be able to build models. My experience tells me that's unlikely. There have been many attempts to build such consortia, sort of pre-competitive data sharing, and they inevitably fall down on considerations of IP and confidentiality and so on. So I don't think it is unfortunately that simple. But better data curation in the public domain would be really good. And there's obviously some great databases like Chembl and PubChem and others where they're bringing together that data. But the sort of careful annotation and curation of that will be absolutely essential. And the other challenge one sees there is that the data sets tend to be very biased. So actually publishing negative results would be really good. You tend to publish the best molecules and look how great they are. But of course, to build a model, the model needs to learn to distinguish between poor and good compounds for whatever properties. And if you don't publish the data on the poor ones, you really can't find those patterns that will enable us to make predictions. So where it's possible to share data, it would be fantastic to do so, and make sure that it's very carefully curated and annotated according to sort of assay protocols and so on. The other big area is in the application of these models and sort of computational technologies in general. So they are being, particularly QSAR models are being widely used. There's more and more adoption of computational methods across pharma and biotech, which is really important and really great to see. But the big area of development that I see is I think what's often known as augmented intelligence. So everyone's familiar with AI, artificial intelligence. I always put AI in quotes because people use it to mean different things depending on how much hype they want to put around a method. So some supposedly AI methods are simple chem informatics. Others are relatively simple machine learning. Everyone's familiar with AI. the idea of augmented intelligence is this combination of human expertise supported and backed up by the computational methods. Humans have still a huge amount of knowledge, experience. They understand strategic objectives. They really can help to guide the optimization of compounds in a way that computers simply can't yet. But they have limited memory, so they haven't seen everything out there. They have limited recall of that, and they have, I hate to say, we all have unconscious biases in the decisions that we're making. So actually supporting that sort of strategic oversight with algorithms that can capture huge amounts of data, can recognize the patterns in that data, and apply that in a very objective and consistent and rigorous way to explore many different tactical options. That combination gives you the best possible outcomes. And that's been shown in many different fields outside of drug discovery. Radiology, for example, combining sort of AI methods for image analysis with human sort of expert radiologists and diagnosticians. I see that combination as being particularly important in drug discovery, and I think a really exciting new area that we're seeing nascent approaches within pharma companies, and it's something we're working really hard on to achieve that synergy.
Need to think of a simple acronym, not AI, but augmented intelligence.
I know, yeah, can't reuse that, yeah.
So, Matt, thank you very much. That's been fascinating and really insightful to chat to you, and I really appreciate your time today covering the topic of QSAR and Phys-Chem descriptors.
It's been an absolute pleasure. No, I've really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Great. And and also thank you for all of you listening to this episode of Pharmaron's DMPK Insights Series. We'd just like to remind you that our DMPK webinar series is also available on demand, covering a variety of key questions related to DMPK science in drug discovery and development. So stay tuned for more podcasts in our Insights series, and thank you. Bye-bye for now.